Dnešním hostem Interview Plus, které natáčíme ve Vídni, je jeden z nejznámějších evropských politologů současnosti, autor knihy Soumrak Evropy Ivan Krastev. Good morning and thank you for being guest of our program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The Czech Republic has found itself now at the center of European events for some time due to a row with Russia and its involvement in explosion of the ammunition depot in Vrbětice in 2014. This case has been also related to your native Bulgaria. The EU and NATO verbally supported the Czech Republic, and some other countries also expel Russians from their embassies. So what this case has shown and the reactions have shown about position of the Czech Republic in the EU and about EU itself?
Listen, of course, first it came as a surprise, because if you're looking at the normal divisions in Europe when it comes to Russia, the Czech republics, and particularly the Czech governments like the Bulgarian one, the Slovak one, the Hungarian as the Mr. Orban, have been much more perceived as the governments that have been trying to look for cooperation than confrontation with Russia. And secondly, obviously, European Union is trying to find a strategy of what do we really want and expect from Russia. We are basically losing the hope of a kind of any major breakthrough in the relationships. Obviously, Russia is testing the European Union, what can be done, and from this point of view, doing it in the Czech Republic was particularly significant, because listen, out of all countries in the world, the United States and the Czech Republic ended up as the two most kind of a hostile enemy countries, which shows that first, for the Russia, Central and Eastern Europe continues to be a priority. And secondly, that the major message which Russia is trying to send is, first, Europe cannot really act effectively, and secondly, we have the power to divide your own societies. It's not you that are going to divide us, it's us going to divide you. This is a risky strategy because, strangely enough, when you see what has happened and the level of risk taken by the Russian government, exporting, basically going with such type of a hostile operation on the territory of a country which was one of the most preferred place for destination for the Russian tourists, a country that had made such an effort to have a normal relationships, shows in my view three things. First is that to a certain extent the foreign policy decision making in Russia is overtaken by the military intelligence. I'm not sure that their foreign ministry was particularly happy of what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. And secondly, and even more importantly, that Russia is looking for the confrontation with the West, trying basically to expose what they believe is going to be the limits of the Western power, but certainly to send a message to their own people is, oh, the post-communist period is over. We are in a war type of a confrontation with the West, so this is a kind of a Cold War type of a divisions, particularly within the Russian society.
Mm-hmm. But the response from the European Union wasn't in the end so strong. We heard voices that the EU doesn't want to escalate the case. Could another government of a new member state gain similar robust support from partners as the United Kingdom have had in 2018 after Salisbury attack? Or does the problem lie more in the Czech political representation itself and its ability to negotiate such a support?
I do believe that there are two things. One is Czech Republic probably related and the other is not. One is that we understand that the Russian government is interested to close the country, but they want us to close the country for them.
You really think?
Yeah, because in a certain way they try to create a confrontation in which it's going to be much more difficult for the Russian citizens to travel abroad, but they want to do it in the way to provoke us to put basically pressure through the basically non-working embassies, because they're expelling so many people from the Western embassies that there is nobody to basically issue visas. And they're using this type of a COVID-19 period because Russian policy can be very much defined as aggressive isolationism. they really try basically, and they start to fear that, well, Russian political system is becoming much more repressive. The number of the Russians who are getting outside of the country and the way of life, particularly in the big urban cities, goes in a different direction. And here comes the Czech problem. The problem is the Czech Republic has been speaking with two voices all this period. So there was the Czech government and particularly the Czech intelligence community that made it very clear what was going on, and then there was the Czech president, which basically was taking a very different position, which was not the United Kingdom's case. And this type of schizophrenia coming from Prague make it also much easier for other countries which were not so eager to take the fight to say, listen, the Czechs first should basically get the unity within the country and then ask others to do what they're doing. So from this point of view, probably others also in the EU utilized the paralysis within the Czech political elite. But what at the same time was very strong in the Czech case was that, listen, Czech Republic is not Poland, and it is not the Baltic states. So this is not a traditional anti-Russian countries with the EU, which, because of history, because of the security reasons, have been very kind of careful of what's happening on their borders. The fact that a country like Czech Republic can take such a strong position, and the reality of what happened in Czech Republic during this period, in my view, was a very strong signal that obviously on the Western side there was a major underestimation of certain type of security threats that come from Russian Federation.
In your book with Stephen Holmes, The Light That Failed, you claim that the old member states demanded that the new ones pretend democracies, and now they accuse them doing so. Do you really think that the new member states are just pretending being democracies, or does it only apply to some of them?
No, our argument was slightly different, particularly about this. Listen, there was this interesting story in the 1990s because democracy was the most important thing that was happening. And then the problem of European integration started. And European integration by its nature is adopting an already existing legislation. This is how we're becoming a member of the club. So in a strange way, you're all the time saying to the countries, you are self-governing yourself, you should decide to yourself, you're going to do this and that. But on the other side, when you're joining the European Union, you should adopt the type of legislation that is there. To the extent that there was a period in which, for example, most of the legislation that have been voting in our parliaments have been not discussed. Because you are not debating European legislation, you're either accepting or not accepting. And I do believe this created this very strange situation in Eastern Europe in which everybody talks about democracy, but you have the feeling that many of the decisions are taken outside of your country. And of course this was used very much by many of the populist leaders who are basically saying, listen, if you want to prove your sovereignty, what you should prove is that you're sovereign from Brussels. So as a result of it, what you see, and you can see particularly strongly in the Hungarian case, but also Poland to a great extent, is what it means to be nationalistic these days in many of our countries is not opposing basically Russia or China or anybody else, but basically you're showing your kind of demand of sovereignty, going against your allies, going against Brussels, going against the United States. And this created this, in my view, paradoxical situation in which okay, if we are democracy, we can say what we want. You cannot tell us anything about our choices.
When you speak about Poland and Hungary, that are members of the V4 group, in my country there has been a lot of debates about the membership in the Visegrad group, if it is still beneficial for the country or on contrary, if it is a burden. Critics of the V4 in the Czech Republic call it toxic club. Is it V4 toxic?
I don't believe that V4 is helping anymore for a very simple reason. I do believe that V4 have been a problem even much earlier, and if it was not for the migration crisis, V4 is going to be very much exhausting its importance, because V4 was an incredibly important moment when the countries were getting into the EU and NATO, but also when you are trying to find their place. But then they're very different countries. They're very different economically, also speaking. Czech Republic and Poland overperforming, Hungary and Slovakia, they're performing on certain type of the four. They also are located differently. They're part of a different type of priorities, even when it comes to foreign policy, with Poland very much preoccupied the size. What was helping this country was that when they had been together, they can claim a certain type of a common position that look legitimate. The idea is if every country is going to do it. But now, what is the common positions that you
I wanted to ask.
And this is the story. I don't see it anymore. For example, I don't see it anymore because in a certain way, Hungary decided on a way of its own, which is very different than anybody else, even Poland. If you're going to see, basically, Hungary became the major defender of the Chinese interests in European Union, expelling American university, opening a big Chinese university in Hungary. Prime Minister Orban is basically very much trying to get a special relationship with the Russian leadership. So from this point of view, the V4 started to be used by the Hungarians as the way to justify policies which are very much national decisions, but out of this kind of a legacy of solidarity as if others are buying it. Poland, on the other side, very much being afraid to remain alone when it comes to the rule of law issue, very much relied on the Hungarian veto. But for Slovakia and the Czech Republic, I don't believe that they're getting anything out of it. And what I see very much happening these days is that while some politicians agreed probably the idea of a Central Europe makes sense, Central Europe should not be V4. So you can see the attempts in Belgrade to get Austria in. You see basically trying to get countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Croatia to make it bigger in order to say it's much more about the last enlargement, the new European member states and so on, than the classically V4, because in the classically V4, Czech Republic and Slovakia is just becoming attachment to the Polish and Hungarian government. What can change also is that we're going to have elections in these countries. And people behave as if Hungary is always going to be in the way it is, that Poland is always going to be the way it is. Listen, Poland is a very polarized society. There are two Polands. In a certain way, Poland very much politically resembles the United States.
We both come from a country with a communist past, and many countries and politicians in the former Eastern Bloc are once again politically leaning to the East, to the authoritarian powers like Russia or China. Why?
Listen, you can even be authoritarian and being anti-Russian, anti-Chinese, the Polish government. But the story is what is basically happening is that in our countries, what is very much contested is not democracy and the stand of the right of the majority to elect government, but it's very much about check and balances. And the more polarized society is, the more you don't believe in the neutrality of institutions. You don't believe that courts can be independent. You don't believe that media could be independent. You always say, if I'm not controlling them, then the opposition is controlling them. And what you're seeing in many countries, and I have seen this in Bulgaria, I can see in other places, is that the governments start to concentrate, and this goes on trying to control business, trying to control media, trying to have a strong influence in the independent institutions. So democracy is very much perceived as classical democratic majoritarianism. And why people are supporting this is a much more interesting question. Because why governments are not interested to have a strong oppositions, it's not easy to understand. But why people are not doing this? And people are not doing this, and I do believe from this point of view, Mr. Kaczynski has hit a point with his idea of the legal impossibilism, is that these populist leaders go to the public and say, do you know what? You want a major change. If you want a major change, you should give me enough power. Because otherwise I cannot do this because of the courts, I cannot do it because of the central bank. If you're not going to give me enough power, I cannot be accountable, I cannot do what I have promised you. And because there are certain segments of societies that are really going for radical change, they're ready to give a lot of power to these leaders, forgetting that when people get a lot of power, they're not in the business of returning this to you. And this is why we ended up with a lot of captured states, with a lot of political corruption. It's not about small briberies given here and there. This is very much government control over business. And the fact that also you have the freedom because of the European Union to travel, to do business here and there, this type of authoritarianism is not so much in your face, like in places like Belarus or Russia, where basically you don't have other choices. So very strong part of the non-political members of the society, they said, there is not much a difference who is in power. Why I should care? So this kind of a creeping concentration of power has become a major issue in Central and Eastern Europe, while even in some of the dysfunctional democracies in the West, because of a longer tradition of independent institutions, you can see that they are basically performing better.
And why is not the current EU able to reverse this trend, to face it or to challenge it?
But to be absolutely honest on this, I don't believe that European Union can on its own challenge any country, because if basically European Union can functions only on two levels. First, if there is a strong civil society or political opposition to these regimes, they can strongly empower them, for sure. But if basically, which was the case in Hungary, because of a specific situation, the government managed to get constitutional majority, to capture certain institutions, European Union does not know what to do, because European Union is a community of governments, more than anything else. And all of these governments get their veto rights. And here you have two types of positions which are problematic on the East. On one is governments like Polish and Hungarian, who basically oppose the European Union on major issue, particularly on sovereignty issue. Why are you going to tell us that we need an independent judges? We are the ones to decide who should be in our courts, and listen, for many people it sounds reasonable. The other is what you can see in countries like Romania or Bulgaria, where nobody is opposing the European Union. These governments never create a foreign policy tensions for the European Union, but on the other side you basically are trying to accept every criticism coming from outside, but not to implement much. So this kind of an informal authoritarianism, in certain way, can be even much more dangerous than the situation in the polarized societies like Poland and Hungary, because as a result of the polarization, those who basically do not accept this way of governments are coming on positions that can give a second chance for democracy in these countries. While if basically you live in a situation in which people believe that nevertheless who comes to power nothing is changing, this type of a spread of cynicism and mistrust, in my view, is the worst that can happen. And this is what really worries me about the things that we see, not only in our part of the world, but in the democratic world in general, is that mistrust is becoming default option.
Now we have pandemic in Europe, all over the world, and you wrote a book about it called Is It Tomorrow Yet? And in this book you write that COVID-19 is likely to end the globalization as we know it, and the European Union will not be the same after the crisis as well. So how do you think both will change?
Listen, and there was so much written about COVID-19 that if you can basically transform every article or conference that we have been writing into those vaccine, probably all Europeans are going to be vaccinated. But the most important story is that first, and this is almost clear, is as a result of the COVID-19, we have certain type of trends that have been present before strongly accelerated. It is not that the ship of humanity changed course, but it changed speed. Many of the things that we are seeing have been there before, but over 1 year, the speed of change is incredible. For example, digitalization, it was there. But can you imagine that we are going to have our kids studying basically on the screen all day? Can you imagine that most of our conversations and conferences are going to be on Zoom? So this happened overnight. And of course, the US-China confrontation was there. But now, over 1 year, you have a major decoupling to the extent that I'll be surprised if in 5 years we are not going to talk about two very separate technological spheres. You're either going to use the Chinese equipment, the Chinese search machine, or the American search machines and others. So from this point of view, it's not a Cold War where the wall is in the physical space, it's very much going to be in the digital space. And all this is putting Europe in a very difficult position because European Union is based on several assumptions that have been very much challenged by this crisis. The first is that economic interdependence means security. So the more basically you're trading with somebody, the less is the risk of war, the less is the risk of conflict. But then you realize that if you're very strongly traded with somebody and this somebody decided to hurt you, of course, he has a much more opportunity for this. And then also European idea that military power doesn't matter much was very much challenged. So European Union is going to be forced in three directions. One is first, it will become slightly more protectionist, for sure, because the world is becoming much more protectionist. We are not going to be open to others if others are closing to us. And this is particularly true when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, and so on. Certainly, and this is interestingly, well, the COVID-19 did not make people to believe that European Union did very well. It forced us to realize that this is the only option for us. In this big and much more hostile world, there is no place for small states and small economies. You cannot be protectionist being a Czech Republic, or being Bulgarian, or even being Germany. You need a bigger market in order to protect. And from this point of view, it gives a new legitimacy to the European Union, but at the same time, people became very critical because also during the COVID-19, and for me, this is the most important component of this crisis, it was the nationalist moment and European moment at the same time. Nationalist because you understand that national government and national community really matter. Even cultural specificity matter. In the moment of crisis, it's important people around you to speak a language that you know best. But at the same time, you realize that you cannot live your life closed in your apartment, and the same way you cannot live your life closed just in your nation state. You need Europe. So how Europe is going to manage to basically meet the expectations of a much more effectiveness when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to foreign policy is a question. But this crisis is an opportunity for the EU. And not because it was perceiving Europe as a community of values, but as a community of faith. We realize that we're in this together.
What about the populists or the anti-EU powers? Because during the last crisis, the migration one, this crisis strongly strengthened them. What about this crisis? Could they also benefit from such a crisis like the health or pandemic crisis?
We had this conversation when the crisis started, and I was on a strong opinion, and on this probably I was right, that in the beginning of the crisis the populists are not going to be the major beneficiaries, because populism is very much rooted in anxiety. You have the feeling that something goes wrong, that your views of the world are not represented, but then the crisis came and it was not about anxiety, it was a fear of being infected, the fear of dying. So the governments were the first big beneficiaries. Nevertheless, by the way, who was in government? Secondly, the migration crisis very strongly divided the pro-European and anti-European. Not this crisis. For example, it's not by accident that Salvini is part of the majority supporting Draghi. You are not going to see, for example, when it comes to the response of the crisis, Poland being very different of what they're doing with for example, in comparison with Germany or France. So strangely enough, this crisis did not reproduce the major pro-Europe, anti-Europe divide that came with the migration crisis. And what we see is not that some of the populist parties are losing support, but their position is changing. And by the way, some of the mainstream parties' position is changing. For example, there is now no major EU political party that is interested to get out of the Eurozone, even Marine Le Pen. At the same time, basically, there is no major party in Europe which is totally for open borders, even the Greens in Germany. So strangely enough, and this was also my argument in the book, there were three crises that very much brought the three major debates in Europe. The first was the crisis on war on terror, how government, how much democracy, how personal freedoms. And then was the economic crisis, and it was about the role of the government, and then there was the migration crisis, and it was the borders. All these had been revisited as a result of this crisis, because this crisis brought all the three again. It was about personal freedoms because of the quarantines and the states of emergency. It was about economy, and then you see basically European Union is doing just the opposite of what it did during the global financial crisis with a major stimulus package. And when it comes basically to migration, the message very much is we should control probably better the outside borders of Europe, but it should be no way that we're going to give up on the internal borders, that the internal borders should be open in order for the economy to function. So as a result of it, this crisis was the second coming of the three previous crises, but we came to different conclusions.
When I return once again to this past crisis, as you mentioned them, hasn't liberal democracy proved to be inefficient or ineffective in such a crisis as we talk about them?
Listen, but strangely enough with the COVID-19, the strange story was that the nature of the government was not the biggest predicator who is doing well and who is doing badly. There were authoritarian states that did well, and from this point of view, of course, China is the example number one. There were authoritarian states which didn't do well. And by the way, Russia didn't do well. If you see the number of the excessive death, and strangely enough, this is the only kind of a figure that I found most interesting, because as you know, we're following too many figures these days of what is happening. You're going to see that basically the demographic effect of this crisis on the Russian population was devastating. Secondly, we will not know who did well and who did badly probably in more than 3 or 4 years, because some countries that we have been praising strongly, like Germany in the first wave, or even our countries in the first wave, we did fine. During the second wave, Central and East European countries was a disaster. And then countries that were just a disaster, like the United Kingdom and the United States, they did much better in the vaccinations, so probably on the economic recovery they're going to do it better. What is interesting for the moment is that we talk as if the COVID-19 crisis is over. But in a strange way, it's not going to be over when you don't have a critical mass of vaccinated or people with certain type of immunity everywhere. Because then you have a new variant, everything can come back. Also, psychological effect of it, we don't know. For example, we don't know what the Swedes right or wrong of what they did, because in 3 or 4 years, probably we're going to see certain effects of the crisis all over Europe that we're not aware of. And this is one of the interesting stories for me of this crisis. If there was a dictatorship that was very visible during the crisis, it was the dictatorship of comparisons. We have one and the same crisis on radio and television. We're discussing one and the same issue, and every day the only way to control your government, particularly in the beginning when there is no opposition to be seen, was to comparing how well you're doing in comparison with others. But this is changing all the time. Countries that did well on Monday suddenly collapse on Friday. And I find this type of dynamics very important. The populists didn't benefit from this in general, but what democracies was is on the level of mistrust. But don't forget, there were several democracies that did very well during this crisis. Unfortunately, most of them are Asian democracies. It was South Korea who did very well. It was Taiwan. It was New Zealand. It was Australia. And one of the reasons Asia did better than Europe and the United States is that they have a crisis like this just 10 years ago. So from this point of view, they're better prepared. I'm never going to forget when you fly to Asia and you see all these people with masks and you see they should be crazy. And then now we go on our airports and of course there are people with masks everywhere. So you never know when your disadvantage is becoming your advantage, but democracies are many things to rethink, and one of them, of course, is how you're going to trade off the personal freedoms that you have with the efficiency of the government. So all this, for example, apps that were tracking the virus and so on, of course, this is a form of digital surveillance, but are we decide not to use it? And all these questions, in my view, are going to come, and we should come with answers. And this interesting story is the sensitivity in all of our societies equal? Could it be that in some countries people go for one choices in Europe and in other for others? And how Europe is going to manage this diversity? Because the paradox is that in Europe now we are narrowing diversity of policies, but we start to have a very divergent regimes. Because what you see on the level of choices in some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, when it comes to certain rights, particularly sexual minorities and others, and what you see in places like Hungary and Poland, goes in a very different direction. And they should be diversity. I don't believe that we should be the same. We should not be the same. By the way, American states are not the same. There are different sensitivity here and there, but what is the basic level which allows you as a European citizen to feel equally secure nevertheless where you go?
Uzavírá dnešní interview plus bulharský politolog Ivan Krastev. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.
S vámi se loučí Filip Nerad.